And we're recording.
We are live. No, I'm just kidding. What is going on, everybody? It is the Cavoy Boys, Big Sig to Dawn, Master Signified Bodies with Free Beer Manana. Free Beer Manana means tomorrow you will get a free beer on Taco Tuesday. So be aware of that.
If you mention Ponta Lisa's name,
Yeah.
only
Mhm.
little secret.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are we going over today in today's session for seminar 2?
Well, Andrew, today we are going over some questions for the teacher. Very innocent sounding title for this lecture, but one that runs the gamut. Is that the expression? Runs the gauntlet.
Yeah.
Runs the gamut from language, dreams, desire, death, Oedipus. We get an overture to what will be a much more in-depth exploration of the Oedipus myth in the next chapter. And this is Lacan inviting his interlocutors to press him with questions, which you got to hand it to the guy. Most analysts, philosophers, most authorities, supposed authorities holding forth on a subject, this is what they dread the most after they deliver their presentation, is taking questions, but he's dedicating an entire seminar saying, ask me questions. What I like about this is he doesn't say, well, tell me where you think I'm wrong. He's just like, no, I'm right. But at what points are you resisting what I'm saying? What might be evading your understanding? To what degree is your complete imbecility getting in the way of you understanding what I'm trying to say?
Which is like totally like an analytic, like transference type question. And at the same time, he wants them to like paraphrase or summarize like what's going on like within like the entire lecture course, like as if they were Lacan himself. Like and I think that's an interesting thing too. And like right off the bat, he talks about like the root of language and even the structure of teaching as grounded by the what he calls the repetition insistence, which is his translation of the French term automatisme de répétition, which is the incorrect form of the German term that is the compulsion to repeat. And he actually sees this at the foundation of a special type of learning, which is in teaching, which is different from what you'll probably later term the university discourse, right? Because the university discourse separates truth from knowledge, if I'm not mistaken. But the teacher confuses their symbolic position for their imaginary identification. And in a sense, they think of themselves not only as a teacher, but somebody that already knows knowledge and truth and has it, and there's no learning for them. And so it kind of could curb the repetition insistence upon the student. And so what that means, and what is key to this, he says off the bat, is like there is a measure of ignorance that needs to be taken on the position of a student, which you could also see as a truth arising from error, or what we'll learn that in like transference, there's the feeling of being duped, this necessary dupeness for learning to occur and for the teacher to arise. So,
and this can't but remind us of an earlier lecture we talked about some months ago. Of course, the one where maieutic were discussed and the Meno. And there was a lot covered in that lecture, among other things, sort of this idea of the ego of philosophy, the psychological ego, which is somewhat like the Cartesian ego that's transparent to itself, which is confused for subjectivity. But that's not actually as relevant as this aspect of the methodology of maieutic that supposedly brings out, in the Platonic sense, an eternal truth that, fleshes it out in a way that would attest to, the eternality of that truth in
Right.
a formal sense, beyond, in the heaven of ideas, let's say. But later in this seminar, we'll remember that Lacan contrasts that concept of learning and truth with the more psychoanalytic idea of it, which coincides strangely with sort of Kierkegaardian repetition. Remember, he mentions Kierkegaard, how Kierkegaard couldn't repeat this perfect experience he had in Berlin, this wonderful night out that, left him with all these pleasant memories, and his attempts to try to repeat that didn't work. And it's the error, it's learning through error that I think psychoanalysis prizes most of all. What does it have to do with insistence, though, and the compulsion to repeat that goes on by itself automatically?
Well, it again, like, it ties in with this notion of ignorance, which is just, to be duped within the transference, that your desire aligns with what the other, or the teacher in this case, has to give, this knowledge, and in this evokes the compulsion to repeat. We could see this as formulated in later seminars, like the objet, the jouissance that the other has. And so why it aligns with transference is because it's evoking the unconscious, the repetition of that desire to know, the desire to be cured, or to attain the enjoyment that comes with the knowledge that the master or teacher has to give. And it's also a repetition in the sense that you're learning from error, because this is the type of teaching that psychoanalysis gives, right? And the fact that really the teacher is not a master, but you're learning to work through your own ignorance. And to be clear about ignorance, right? It's not just like, not knowing, like being like a bigot, or like how most people think of it. Like, what is it that you hear in most like liberal political discourse? Oh, everybody just has a willful ignorance just to not know the facts, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically from a position of méconnaissance, of misrecognizing your place within this transferential experience in which your desire is kind of taken out of you, and being lured by the other, and thinking that the other has something that's outside of you, right?
So,
but and really, it's pretty much putting the subject supposed to know, and actually the subject of the unconscious revealing itself within that lack, within that desire, that insistence, because that is where the error starts from.
Yeah, we could say maybe that the itinerary of desire is mapped out, in a sense, through this transferential relationship. So I think the concept of error is not, oh, you have been misinterpreting a desire that is clearly defined, but on another plane. Where when we talk about this new signifier, we're talking about a condensation of signifiers. And the only way to arrive at it is through kind of bumping up against the guardrails of the path of your desire.
Right.
And being constantly, in a sense, thrown off and sent in another direction. So that you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this idea of the metonymy of desire, where it jumps from one thing to another. I like this idea of metonymy too, because it's like, with metonymy, literally, I think it's like you take an aspect of something, and that aspect stands for the
Right.
whole, stands
yeah.
for the totality of the noun, so that there is a totality in a sense to one's desire that's made up of various signifiers, but there's only a specific, peculiar vantage point from which you can ever encounter your desire. So the ignorance is always the half truth of your desire. As soon as you've settled upon a signifier of your desire, it will always be partially hidden and occluded. There is no perfect vantage point, but the idea is that, as I understand it, you become less ignorant of the itinerary of your desire, of its metonymy, and you understand, and this isn't a factual understanding, but in a sense, the word he's going to use later, it's sort of you realize, you bring into the real of your experience the very action and activity of desire itself. Any of that you disagree with? Or
no, I think that's a very articulate way to express it. I want to like even focus on the fact of that this ignorance is, as you said, like it's really just a half truth, but we should realize that for Lacan, and he mentions this in Seminar 1 about ignorance. I think it's like in the beginning of Seminar 1, that it has like a sort of passion that's necessary for the truth to arise from error, and that means it's located in the imaginary realm. So for those that like have a sort of ambivalence for a teacher or like a certain subject, and even for psychoanalysis and Lacan for that matter, how many analysts or people that are in certain schools of thought that don't like Lacan because they can't understand him, or they think that like, oh, like he just like the way he writes or speaks, like it's just like overly intellectual and like just, you know, psychotic or whatever, and like they can only see it from an imaginary standpoint in which he's supposed to be expressing some sort of truth, you know, that makes him unique, but they're only kind of idealizing him from that point of misrecognition, and they never take it further, because there's those that just will dismiss it right away, but then it's like those that don't understand what he's saying, and yet they become hooked. It's like, what is this guy saying? I want to learn more. And they even go beyond maybe idealizing him and realizing the symbolic efficacy or structure of the discourse of psychoanalysis, and even work through that half truth or dupeness of seeing this discourse or the position of Lacan from an imaginary level, which is also relating. And you see this with teaching as well. Like people hate their certain teachers, and that dismisses them from ever learning that subject again. It's like, oh, I hated my history teachers, so therefore I hate history and I never want to learn it, which that is part of the error as well that one needs to work through.
the error of intersubjective identification.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Because this is what happens. It reminds me of I don't think it's a specific meme, but basically the premise of different memes, where sometimes, usually it's one of the sort of like incel heroes, anti-heroes, like Joker or American Psycho. What's it?
Patrick Bateman. Yeah.
You know, and the subtitle would be, oh, like, he's me, that's so me. And that's an imaginary identification, but it's like that's the moment that usually caps off one of these important revelations. Almost is like, yeah, we have these great insights, but then the next thing to follow that insight is usually, and there I am, and behind, at the other end of that insight, is my own mirror image. That's who I am. So
Right.
once I've had this revelation, maybe we could even say the negative therapeutic reaction is to also see yourself in it.
Yeah, and that's good that you brought up the therapeutic reaction, because I was already starting to recollect on, bringing these examples into the clinic. And for instance, again, going back to seminar one, the issue with Anna Freud was the, like, I guess you could call it like an act of countertransference, but really like where it always remains in this intersubjectivity um framework in the treatment, in which this woman who filled with a lot of anxiety, and I forget like what her diagnosis was, but how she had like a very like ambivalent relationship with her mom. And I think what the interpretation was, that Anna Freud was like kind of sensing that she was being put in the position of her mother. And so, to calm her down, like, it's like, no, I don't have any, ill, will, or, ill feelings towards you, to like calm her down. And right there, what you see is this mirroring relation of saying like, no, I don't feel like this towards you. You should understand that like this is just like what you're reacting towards is the transference, and realize that you have to separate illusion from reality, and remember what your position is: a patient being going through treatment, and I'm the analyst, right? They're positing this like dyad, in which, every time you're relating to me, you have to kind of decipher, what is true and what is false. Like right here, like this is what Lacan wants to get away from. And I even think someone like Ferenczi kind of falls into this framework of relational work, in which, again, what we have to decipher is like, oh, this is a fantasy, and right here is the reality of the situation. And what Lacan says is like, truth is already structured like a fiction. You don't step outside the fantasy; you always work through it, because and that's like what is it, the plague of fantasies? Zizek's transcendental schematism is to say that outside of the fantasy there is the real thing, or the thing in itself, the Kantian thing, and that's what I need to get to, because my fantasies are tricking me. I'm delusional, and I will be in this position of truth and authenticity, or whatever the case may be. But right there is already a misrecognition.
Fantasies often don't even include within them the attainment of the thing, so much as the fantasy explains why there's an obstacle to it and places the barrier to the thing in itself where it is. We tend to assume that people's fantasies delude them because they explain how something can be procured in overly simplistic terms. But no, really, most fantasies are geared towards actually, like, in some sense, I don't mean this psychoanalytically, but foreclosing the possibility of getting something.
Yeah. And
About it.
and like whenever somebody even like recalls like a fantasy or something like that, or like the way that we use it, um, kind of nonchalantly, is like, oh, it's just like, it's not real. It's just, it's like they treat it reductively, or like, oh, that's just your fantasy. I mean, like that's also the problem of transference in a lot of these other modalities of psychoanalysis, is that when it comes to the negative reactions in the transference, the resistance, maybe certain cases of ambivalence and hate towards, it's kind of invalidating the theoretical, or the therapeutic potency that comes with actually digging deeper and saying like, oh, this is too much. Your fantasy is just going out of control, and inhibiting the treatment, or that's just your fantasy. That's just the reaction of the transference. It's okay. It's natural.
Right, right. It's you're actually getting rid of the mega important byproduct of the process itself in favor of supposed demystification.
Yeah,
So let's talk about, I think this is Mademoiselle. Is that
I'm not
MMLLE?
sure.
Ramnu, I think. Our first question is this common discourse as it intersects with, as they put it, the source of repetitive symptoms, a death instinct. I don't exactly
So,
know what the question is here, other than that's like sort of does it
yeah,
do they coincide at a point of this indefinite multiform desire, something without an object, a desire for nothing, and then what is death in this context? And
right.
what does Lacan have to say here?
Yeah. So like she's pretty much, or like, yeah, I don't know if it is Madam or what, but Ramanu pretty much is trying to formulate. It seems like this defense function is actually at the surface rather than something deep. And at the same time, it's a defense against trauma from outside and from within. Like if we look at the Freudian processes of like the man, what was it? Those triads of like what was it? Alpha, omega, psi, I think, or
Yeah, was it phi
phi,
side?
psi, and omega.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you have the instinctual excitation that comes from within, and then also these certain variables and energies and excitations that come from without outside. And I think that's what is kind of being echoed for right here. And this defense function is related to common discourse. And I'm still grappling with like what is meant by a common discourse, but I think throughout the text it kind of gets formulated as just something that has to deal with the ego and the way that it intersects within its own mirroring function with others, and how we even learn, and how we learn discourses or education, sciences, etc. And identifying with it. Yeah.
I just understood it as like symbolic order.
And it could that could be too, because of the intersection. It's always intersecting between not only its own imaginary relation, but also the world of symbols, as you'll say. This other
Right.
this other one right here is interesting, though. The other question has to do with death. It's because, yeah, at first it seems like there's this the aim towards the inorganic state, right? The aim to return to matter. But then no, like was really aiming at is nothing. This desire, this drive doesn't have an object, and so we figured
Right.
out that's what this like this compulsion to repeat, this death instinct is all about. But then it kind of is like, well, what is death then? Like the notion of death has a
Right.
now.
Because when Lacan talks about death, he doesn't mean mere perishing. And he doesn't mean, nor does he mean inertia. It's almost more like the desire to never have been, is how I imagine it. But in that never having been, also to gain a kind of immortality. Now he's not going to talk about enjoyment yet, but
Right.
here we have something that's like at loggerheads with
Yeah.
itself, which
I
is
mean,
what enjoyment is. It's not just
yeah.
about missing the object in the sense that, oh, well, it finds an object and circumvents it deliberately. It's more like the object it misses is its own movement
Yeah.
in a sense, which perpetuates the movement
Yeah.
paradoxically. And that is, I think, maybe at this stage, maybe not, the understanding Lacan has of death in this way. Now, here, then he moves on to talk about this recentering upon the ego that happens in psychoanalysis, and compares it to the psychiatrist who suddenly sort of almost takes a, yeah, or not almost, takes a sort of moralizing stance when it comes to these situations in which someone commits a crime, or let's think of a serial killer who murders a lot of people. They might half diagnose the person, but also in get impute guilt upon them, and basically say that they're subject to the same kind of responsibility as anyone else. So suddenly they become a kind of uh you know moral social commentator here, rather than a purely clinical appraiser of the situation.
Right.
And then he compares that to a similar phenomenon in psychoanalysis at the time, where there's a return to the ego as the center and common measure of all things, which I think it's not a very obvious parallel here between the vignette or the situation that he outlines in the previous paragraph, but it's almost like, well, what's the cause? Who's culpable here? In the case of psychoanalysis, well, it's the ego that's culpable. The ego is the culprit. The ego is where our work should be directed towards, and that in itself is a misrecognition.
Yeah, and no, it's true though, and you see that, and that's the problem with relational therapy and even like object relations. And well, the main thing that they see in transference, it's like, oh, look for projective identifications. Look when the patient is splitting onto you and projecting all the bad things that they don't want to identify within the ego as a defense mechanism, and they put it onto the analyst. It's like, well, that's all fine and dandy, but we could create all these schemas and become a little idolaters of the ego and always miss what's really going on, whether it's acting out, whether it's the subject of enunciation, these parapraxis that's really at the heart of the Freudian doctrine, the Freudian experience and discourse, is who is the subject, not the subject of the ego, but the subject of the unconscious.
Right, which I just want to add here in this last line of the paragraph. He says it comes under the common discourse, the crime committed. So again, the common discourse, if we think about it as the chain of signifiers or symbolic order in a sense, it's sort of like, well, now the symbolic order is affirmed as absolute. The big other is said to exist, even though theoretically we want to get to a point where the big other is held in suspension.
Right.
But in this social context, the common discourse is validated as over and above existing on its own, in a sense. That's what I'm getting from this. And it's sort of like the same is true of the supremacy of the ego, in that, well, if we affirm the ego, then it should have a place to neatly slot into as soon as psychoanalysis is done. And that's just not going.
No.
Like, no, there's no place for the ego to slot into.
Yeah, and it also makes me think if the common discourse has something to do with empty speech, since we're still dealing with the early Lacan, who's focusing on function and field a lot.
Yeah, I could be totally wrong about
but
all
but
this.
it
I'm
is
just sort of spitballing, but
it is interesting to think about it because I'm reflecting on the whole metaphor or analogy with the psychiatrist. It's like he's caught in the intersects of having to diagnose and having to subject someone to the law because of their crimes, especially when the confusion is that to find that this person, they must be responsible, but at the same time, their actions had no motivation whatsoever, whether like any legal motivation, or if there was just like this will to kill. And so it's like, oh, well, my job as a psychiatrist, you can see that there's a possible disturbance of affectivity lacking in content. These things are lacking of contact, things that are so abominable that, no average person would do. And yet we have to subject him to the law for his crimes as being guilty. Right. And that's how it ends up in the common discourse, because it's really contradictory when what's been being put into question is not just the serial killer, but like the position of the psychiatrists and their discourse themselves.
Exactly. As yet another pillar of moral rectitude.
Yeah.
Sense. Let's talk about Oedipus. He brings it back to Oedipus, mentions the purloined letter quickly. Oedipus undergoes a kind of subjective destitution, in that at the end of the tragedy, he has nothing with which he can identify. In that sense, he is pure subject, but only because it's like he hasn't fully been initiated into the symbolic order. We could say so. He is death. He loses his humanity at his final hour in a sense, but I don't think I'm explaining it all that well.
Isn't it interesting though? Like I'm thinking about it, like because we don't when we talk about like the subject before before the symbolic order or anything like that, it's something that can only perceive retroactively. Because if we look at, and I'm going to spitball here too, if we look at the beginning of Oedipus Rex, right, it's the oracle which delivers the message of Oedipus and how he's going to murder his father and take over as the king, as king of Thebes, right?
I believe so.
And then marry his mother. Right there is already the something of the future being delivered in the past, in a sense. And then it's pretty much like what I'm trying to say. It's like it's almost like the whole notion of the return of the repressed coming like from the future,
right,
in that moment. And that's what the subject is. And really, as he comes to realize his subject of the unconscious, it's something that is also devoid of the big other, because finally he's in subjective destitution. But it's something that is like a revelation of a void, rather than like, oh, some pure subject that's like substantial, outside of the symbolic order, like a meta language. That's not exactly what it is. It's actually something that is just like a less than nothing, to be Zizek'ian about it. That's all I can think of.
No, that's what I meant by pure subject, and I'm glad you pursue that line of thought, because it's like I don't want to substantialize the subject in this sense.
Don't be a Leclerc.
I don't want to amplify on a bad day. But like the scene is set, the conditions are in place for him to be stripped of every identification that makes up his entire universe. I think it's important to point out that he is rewarded his wife, who turns out to be his mother, because he answers the riddle of the Sphinx.
Right.
So in a sense, it's like what we have is also this dissolution of basic bonds, those bonds that are definitive of what it means to also be a subject in the social sense. Whereas like as soon as you commit incest, you in a sense, you seek being a son to your mother. In one sense, your mother seeks being a mother to you. That was a weird ceases to be a mother to you. So it's like the entire symbolic framework sort of collapses in on itself. And then what is the result but this return to a state of pure relation,
right?
Relative, right? These people are relatives, relative to you. And then to be pure relationality is like to be the letter. It's to have absolutely no orientation in the universe, and then to be completely desubstantialized in a sense.
Yeah. And to kind of like touch upon that, like with some final words, this is where like Lacan really is savvy, not only like maybe dialectically, but also understanding certain deadlocks of the structure, in which someone like maybe Levi-Strauss couldn't go far enough. But really, when it comes to the subject, the symbolic subject, where Althusser kind of fails, because he's focused on perfect interpolation, right? And that's subjectivization of your role as an ideological subject. And yet his frame of elementary structure and how base and superstructure make us subjects doesn't take into account this sense of retroactivity, but also in ways that the subject fails at subjectivizing itself because it's not whole, it's not total. Interpolation doesn't apply a full subject under ideological apparatus, but actually something that is incomplete. And that's where that point of failure arises, because the structure itself is incomplete. And the incompleteness is also where the deadlock of the incest of prohibition, or the prohibition of incest, lies, and how that subject of the unconscious, that hysteric subject, comes about to traverse like that less than nothing.
Right. And this gap, right? So there's a gap
Yeah.
produced by the failed interpolation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the symbol in its insistence, I feel like it throbs in that gap in a certain sense. I don't know if that's superego or not, but that sort of get it right insistence as it's manifested in a specific symbol is alienating.
Yes.
The subject, the subject, you continue to interpret a message that is the same syllable repeated again and again forever. And the different identifications I think that we're dealing with here aren't, as much as they appear very heterogeneous and coming from many different sources, it's kind of like the same symbol under different guises, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Again and again. It's just like in Oedipus, he can't at the end afford himself the distance of the ultimate virtual egoic point where it's like he ceases to have an ego in a sense. That's why he's an impossible figure.
No, yeah.
What about what we have? What about what we say? What he says here about like dreams, desire, wish fulfillment. You know, he goes into this whole thing about, well, what is desire versus wish fulfillment versus dream work?
Yeah, I thought that was it's definitely an interesting section. This is what, like 210, right? Or is this
211?
11? And like I think right here what's interesting is that, like, for Lacan, right, his notion of desire is obviously something that has to deal with lack and the desire of an other. And I think for Freud, wish fulfillment is just something that, well, you obviously can't achieve your wish in the waking life, so because of the, you know, the reality principle and the pleasure principle can't achieve. But I think the problem with the wish fulfillment is that it's something that is always being enacted in the dream, and that's how it gets satisfied. But desire is never satisfied, and I think that's what Lacan is trying to get at. And he mentioned something right here about like objecting like the notion of the children's dream in Freud, because he points out that the problem with Freud's analysis of the majority of children's dreams are from a genetic view of things. And what that means is that his early notion of libido development and, you know, the stages, how he sees it on a sort of physiological genetic makeup, and that implies also the processes of regression, in which, well, if a child is not able to gain satisfaction libidinally in its development, well, then that genetic model will still try to fulfill itself, so that I could go through all those stages in this wish fulfillment of the dream. But I don't think like Lacan, you know, is really down for that. And I mean, I can't say why that's the case, but I think we kind of get an understanding that like he's not focused on biologizing you know, the framework of understanding wish fulfillment, or even just desire, which he's going to take on, which is different from wish fulfillment.
Right. And Valabrega, being the hardhead that he is, kind of presses the question and says, Freud talks about how there is this desire to maintain sleep, to secure sleep, and then the fulfillment of a desire. But Lacan talks about the fulfillment as realization, meaning what is at this point for him realite, right? Reality, and the difference between a metaphorical fulfillment and a realization.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That there's like hallucinatory satisfaction, which can't be said to be the same thing as the realization of a desire, if I understood this.
Right. And I mean, I haven't gotten to that point in the interpretation of dreams, but I think there's this understanding of like a dream could have a hallucinatory effect. And I think that's what he wants to talk about in hallucinatory fulfillment versus like the fulfillment of a wish within the dream, which, I mean, let's take that to be the parallel of the Lacanian object cause of desire being enacted, like the Fort Da type thing within a dream versus that, oh, there's a hallucinatory aspect, maybe like a displacement, or I don't know, like that I'm definitely, that one I'm not as familiar with, so I'll have to take the L on that. But that's, if I had to like kind of spitball, that's what I would imagine it to be.
Well, okay, so this is interesting. Valabrega is like, okay, so is this a distorted fulfillment?
Right. Because yeah, he does.
Is what we're seeing as like a distortion where it, as if you're dealing with a psychic state that cannot like properly define the object of a desire for want of reference points coming from a more like consistent, stable reality. But
Yeah.
Lacan doesn't think it's so much like that. And I had to read this a few times to get it, but he's talking about this bird who they give up their positions alongside their mates if they lose out to an adversary who is also making advances on another bird. They do that. I had to look this word up, ectopic of sexual display. It's like something that's like a substitution where they like groom their feathers, meaning they don't get what they were looking for here, which is of course sex. So in lieu of that, they like groom their feathers. But he says this is like throwing another circuit into gear. So is this a symbolic satisfaction, or is this like a substitution? Is this a distortion? That is the bird doing the same thing that they aim to do initially? Not really. It's like a substitutive satisfaction, rather than a distortion. So it's not like a misinterpretation of the thing that was aimed for. It's a substitution. That's what I got from this.
Yeah. It's starting to make sense, and it's like it's more of a substituted, but like it's not like a sublimation of it. It's actually just trying to still. It hasn't sublimated the desire because it never achieved it, so it has to achieve it in some metaphorical way that would compare to the thing. And again, Fort Da, it's like these substitutes of toys representing the mother, but not to achieve the mother, but to to the master the scene of loss.
Right, because the in the Fort Da game, the child doesn't think that the real and the toy are the mother. They know that it's a substitution. So in dreams, these are maybe substitutions.
Yeah.
For the real thing. But I think it's probably more complicated than just that. This was a very tricky passage.
Yeah, no, that's definitely very like it's a lot to pack in that specific part.
There. But before we go on a break, I want. Can you hear?
You're kind of cutting off. I can hear you now.
Before we go on a break, I wanted to talk about what he says here. I think I wrote something down about unconscious fantasies.
Yeah.
And the ego. It's confusing because we already know like the dream is not a fantasy, but the dream, in its method of displacement of signifiers, condensing of signifiers, might follow the very seams of an unconscious fantasy when worked through, right? It's not the fantasy itself, but the unconscious is fantasy in a set, like
well, yeah, because there is the unconscious
fantasy. The dream, when through dream work, something of the unconscious fantasy can be revealed, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. Yeah. Or what's called the primal fantasy in Freud, and later taken on by Laplanche as well. The primal scene is what is really being enacted, and I mean, I think that's even what somebody like Leclerc was getting at with this patient when he's like comes up with a different wordplay to come up with poor jelly, because he's got that dream of the unicorn. I think, like, I forget how the dream plays out, but ultimately it leads to like realizing that there was a primal fantasy of like seeing like his mother, like this like love for his mother or some shit.
Right. And that, he contrasts it with daydreaming, which would be a much more intentional and I don't want to say rational, but like strategic pursuit,
right,
of a specific imaginary object of desire.
Yeah, and I think like they're definitely different from dreams, but what is it that Zizek says that in fantasies are ways in which uh desire trains itself, teaches itself how to desire. And so what it is like, not only are you exercising your lack, but there's also imaginary identification in that sense too, which is different from a dream.
That's a really good point. You can't really identify where you are in a dream. That's the thing.
You can only do so retroact, like recalling the dream.
Let's do you want to take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, we can take a 5.
All right.
What time is it right now? Okay, so it's 21, so 9:19. So we'll do, was it 24, right?
We're recording again.
Back at it.
Okay. And then we have Madame C. Audrey asking about the ego as a fragment of the common discourse.
Right, yeah.
We talk about humanism a little bit. We talk about Oedipus acting out when he tears his face apart.
Yeah. Is with that part where he tears his face apart, is this where like Lacan, it might be, oh no, it might be in the next page where he's like, it'd be wise to always contemplate on the end of obsessional, whether like in the clinic or like upon death. What are their final actions? Because this is the final act of Oedipus himself.
Right. Is that here or is that a little bit later on?
I think it's like in the next page. Yeah.
But yeah, I looked up acting out again and we were talking about this a little bit. before our chat here, but acting out, how does it work? How is it related to the transference? Maybe it's not especially important in this context, but it's a good opportunity to talk about it. It's sort of when you're acting out, you are performing, much like an actor does, a certain, let's say, scenography almost of the compulsion to repeat.
Yeah.
Like if you're dramatizing a certain
Thing for the
moment
big other.
for the
And
big
that's what it
other.
is. And it makes me think of the scene in Pervert's Guide to Ideology where Slavoj talks about improv acting, in which there's no script. There's only just an earpiece in the actors in which they hear the director talking. So as they're listening to them, it's as if they're bringing out the best of themselves and displaying a stunt or performance for the gaze of the big other. But this is all unconscious. It's not like it's willfully doing it in the case for the clinic.
Right. It's as if, I mean, we're always sort of acting something out, but
Yeah.
what I got from this is that it has to do with the transference,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? And it's a kind of negative response to the transference itself. That's what I read in
No, yeah. Yeah, and so there is like in a sense a resistance, and sometimes it is conscious, but it's like they don't know why they're really doing it or what they're avoiding in this negative response.
Right. I wonder if it has anything to do with the insistence of the symbolic. Maybe
Yeah.
when that compulsion to repeat, when that insistence is especially intense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Right, and this is what differentiates a Lacanian from other analytic work that's only sees transference in this intersubjective relational point. Is that in that point it's like, oh, they're pushing me away, maybe I'm not the right analyst for them, maybe like it's too intense, and it's definitely I'm not seeing any therapeutic result because they don't have an understanding of language in the symbolic order and the real. They're in this like imaginary aspect, and to them something symbolic is only going to be another imaginary figure, right? And one thing that, like, when we talk about, like, let's say they do like object relationist, bro, yeah, maybe if they do take Oedipus complex somewhat seriously, and this crude like way of understanding it, and like the typical Freudian of like, oh, you really want dad, or you really hate your dad and want your brother. It's like, even if they don't have like they never had parents, but they were like an orphan or something, or like they ended up having foster family because of maybe some incidences with their actual biological family. They still see this in an imaginary way. It's like, oh, then it's your caregiver father, or it was like, your foster family that you're really having this Oedipal drama with. It's like, no, that's not the point. The point is that there is this symbolic scansion in which this insistence is coming upon, and it has nothing to do with, uh, these people that they're having an imaginary relation in which there's love and hate, and all these other emotions that happen on the imaginary level of identification and relating.
wouldn't the best way to interpret acting out is almost, instead of just reducing it to the imaginary dynamics of affects, how the affects are aligned, would be to actually look at the mise en scene, the behind the scenes of the scene that's being played out here. What is the exact configuration? Who are the characters in this scene? Where is everyone located?
Yeah.
Really the more concrete the details, in a sense, the more you get away from a kind of psychologizing.
Exactly. Yeah.
situation and see it
No.
in its singularity and uniqueness.
Right.
And I think that's what good scansion is. But
Yeah.
I like this part. We have Durandon. This exchange reminded me of in seminar one when I forget who says it. Maybe it's just like Dr. X, Professor X, Professor Xavier is like, what does he say? Sometimes you just want to take the patient and just rattle them because it's like, you idiot, you're not getting it.
Yeah.
Durandon is kind of getting at something like a similar
Yeah.
frustration. I thought this was a really interesting exchange because Durandon is saying how their patient basically they want their patient, and they use this phrase, to be more self-aware, which is
Yeah. Self-awareness.
really hot right now, right? It's
This is he's the epitome of therapism right here. Like this is what I was.
We want you to be self-aware. We want you to be denuded in a sense and see yourself as you are. Now, the irony here is that, look, they say some things that some of the same cliches you hear a lot today, like it's language is a mode of communication,
Exactly that.
information. We carve up reality. We make sense of reality with language, but language isn't everything. There's certain things that can't be said, but my patient seems to take language a little too seriously as more than just a tool. They think that cowardice and generosity, in questioning their motives, that I do that out of generosity or cowardice, that generosity and cowardice are real things in themselves that can be gotten at. I'm trying to get my patient to surpass these sorts of thingifications, to quote Lacan.
Yeah.
Surpass it, like this desire to make these concepts real, to make words real and perfectly situate themselves. They won't ever be able to do that. The important thing is to cast off these demands that they're making of me and themselves. And Lacan says, you think it's enough to take away his off the peg clothes for him to get a made to measure suit? Dordan's like, no, I want them to be naked. Like
self-awareness, to be
self-awareness,
exposed and vulnerable and
deverbalized, which is like, I took that as meaning like, I want them to stop intellectualizing and get to the meat of what's going on, and that it's not just words. They need to de-verbalize
the core self, the true self of who they are beyond all these words and biases, beliefs, and ideologies. Their neutral self and who they're supposed to be. And that's the purpose of the clinic, is to heal them and figure out their potential and be whole, naked, vulnerable, healthy, compassionate.
Right. Right. And
it's funny is like how, like, when like above on this page he says like Lacan's retort about this notion of like, over verbalizing or over communicating, like, because this person sees language as only a means of communication. That's something that like Lacan already went over in seminar one. And I think he's like, well, like, I haven't been attending your seminars on a regular basis, but I just want to like actually, bro, you, like, to be honest, I don't think language is everything, because there's just some things that can't be communicated, and no such, there are some things called non-verbalized thoughts. But really, like, what's funny is that he dichotomizes things in like the generosity and cowardiceness. And Lacan's like, why don't you fill in what you have just said? Yesterday evening, I mentioned the following type of question. Did I give that out of generosity or cowardice? And I thought that was just like a funny, like, a retort.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, because he says like, basically that there are two kinds of thought. according to this guy, and that the essence of thoughts which aren't ready made is that they're not just thoughts, but
Yeah.
deverbalized thoughts. So, and that is, I think, what a lot of therapy is geared towards today. A lot of therapism, which is you can get at these thoughts, which are, like you're saying, deverbalized and therefore more authentic.
Or what is it? What is it that fucking DBT that I've been telling you about? Like your core beliefs. You have to realize what your core beliefs are. That it's a broken image that creates these core beliefs because of trauma, and trauma always roots in the brain. And so whenever you're like in a situation, right, you become triggered by a fight or flight response that makes you feel these non-verbalized thoughts. Yeah.
What's funny, what's funny is there's truth to that, in that the unconscious does have core beliefs in a sense, but they're not, they can't be articulated as general rules or laws. There is such a thing as an unconscious belief, but it is metamorphosized, however you say that, by the specific situation that you're met with.
Right.
In a sense, it's like your core beliefs. Yeah, like in a sense, I would say the unconscious has convictions, but they're very like malleable.
But what would it be other than desire for something?
But desire, right? The law of desire itself, which, if you think about it, the unconscious is that which doesn't cede ground relative
right
to its desire. The ego does, the neurotic ego does.
Yeah.
But the unconscious always, in a sense, understands its desire, and not that it makes it known,
right,
but it has consequences. It also in the realm of the ego. So I don't know. It's just a thought. I could be talking about all that. I don't know.
It's also funny, just like kind of add in some other like funny discourse in the mix. It's like we already know, like the unconscious is like it's just full of different signifiers, right? It's structured like a language, but it's not one of communication, but of like the other. It's invocatory rather than it is communicating. It's creative, and it is pretty much evoking the discourse of the other. But one thing that we see, like what we pointed out, it's like not just these like core beliefs of like, these are just like triggers, and we got to realize that we have to like know what they are and not worry about verbalized thoughts and stuff like that, and biases and cognitive distortions. But then you have, like, for instance, like conspiracy bros, NLP simps that talk about like, the subconscious, in which like things that you see every day, advertisements and all that, are subconsciously programming your entire subconscious and making you think a certain way.
It's like the Hegelian dialectic.
Yeah.
In the same sort of realm. But yeah, I guess, sorry,
yeah. No, it's just like then you get like something like that where it's just like, okay, no, it's like the subconscious is like a pseudo unconscious, but it's just like this blank slate that's constantly malleable by the clutches of society and other
right.
Send slogans and advertisements. It's like, you crave McDonald's because they're brainwashing you to do that.
Right, it's malleable, but in this case it leaves permanent legible traces that can be unpacked, and
you just got to trick it. The power of the subconscious.
You just have to trick it. You just get around them. But it's like, for us in the unconscious, just desire never quite makes sense, but it does in a certain way lay down a law in the moment, is how I would describe it. I could be wrong about that. That's just an hypothesis, but I like what he says here, where Lacan says to Durandon, why do you think that this question should be connected with shallow or empty speech? It's an authentic question, because you're not actually looking at, in a sense, the speech as the symbolic envelope,
Right.
to use a
Yeah.
certain expression, because you've placed yourself in the same register as your patient here. In dismissing their speech as empty because it doesn't seem to really cut below the surface to what would be at the core of their affective being, or whatever we want to think of it as. But really, we've talked about this before, empty or full speech is not defined necessarily by the content
Right.
of the speech. It could be full speech, could also be extremely banal,
Right. And exactly, like the
or
most like
derivative, or artificial, but it's still could be very much full.
and the thing is like right when he talks about in seminar one about how the unconscious doesn't know negation, right? We get into the understanding of empty speech, full speech, inverninum. Like there is this primordial affirmation. Biao is the immediacy of the discourse of the unconscious, which is full, but it's nothing that's like sort of climactic or like cinematic to it. It could be just really banal. It's when the thing is that empty speech itself can make itself the most climactic and enigmatic. Uh, kind of like an anecdotal experience of like somebody that I knew who does therapy, and literally their patient, like psychodynamic therapy, so watered down psychoanalysis, the patient is just like yelling at them saying, I'm in love with my mother, as if that announces to anything, and like try to pull a freaking Lacanian technique by saying, okay, we could end the session right there. But it's like that's the most like, what's the term? Cliche thing that like there was no acting out, there was no indication of anything that was to be Lacanian, a truth escaping the subject that was or the ego that was more than them, that was outside of the unconscious, right? A truth that escapes the subject, like that was all there, conscious with ambivalence. That right there is nothing like full speech. That right there is empty speech. And even to think about it in a more social sense outside the clinic, empty speech is definitely something that is analogous to the Das Man of Heidegger, the they speak, the they talk. Even in a sense, like philosophy in the way that it's kind of regurgitated in university discourse becomes empty speech.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think a lot of philosophers accuse each other of doing, especially analytic philosophers usually level this criticism against continental philosophers that, oh, well, this is so much hot air that you're speaking so much flowery language. These French theorists feel the need to also make a lot of literary references to cover up the fact that they're really not talking about anything at all.
Like a Chomsky.
We're getting down to what philosophy can do on a purely logical basis. We're logicians,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, and hence like why logical positivists wanted to opt for a purely formal system
Right.
of logic,
And get away from metaphysics.
get away from metaphysics. And which is interesting because that seems to be kind of like the failed attempt to culminate the Cartesian project, because it's like the Cartesian project in many ways was all about finding getting to a point where philosophy could mirror the same irresistibility of truthfulness that one gets with mathematics, where it's like it's undeniably true.
Right.
How can we do that through a kind of formal logic? But
and the person to really just like destroy all logical positivism was Wittgenstein. With like, even though he wasn't in the tradition of continental philosophy, he does draw from a couple of them, like Socrates, and realizing that there's like these like language games that analytic philosophers are doing, or just philosophy in general is doing, and that there it comes to like a sort of paradox and deadlock of what you logically posit as a given fact and what makes sense in its formal structure and given, and being able to relate it to what it corresponds to or correlates with. And what is at stake is the limit of knowing, the limit of having certainty. And that gets in the point is like, well, who is it that's certain? Who is it like, who is positing the question of certainty, right? The subject, and not even like a Lacanian subject, just like the code. Let's just talk about the cogito. A subject for whom knowledge is of importance of, that is absent in most analytic psychology, or that was a slip, analytic philosophy. Because one thing that they don't get at, and I mean now there is, because you still got this more analytic approach to continental themes like mind body dualism. That's always gonna fucking be a thing, because like they don't have a dialectical approach. They're just like, well, we got to know how mental causality could be a thing. What is mental substantiality versus the body, and they just categorize things. And it's like, well, this corresponds to that. We got to know what defines the essence of a body and the essence of a mind, and then we could go from there. Like, it leads to nowhere.
right, or if it's purely formal, then we can do away with any of those categories because they haven't been substantialized to begin with. So let's get rid of all superfluities and just stick with a logic like internal to itself. But what's interesting is that it's like, well, what is an analytic proposition? It's a tautology. So what can analytical philosophy really work on but tautologies? Now, I know people would like jump down my throat for saying that if they're in that camp, because like, well, you're conflating two different forms of like the word analytic, but maybe I am. Anyway, I'm just poking the bear here, but
I saw like a meme that was like saying that analytic philosophy is just like what is it, AI LARPing or some shit like that. I thought that was really funny.
AI LARPing.
Yeah.
um I like what he says here about something you feel in your gut,
Right.
it setting into motion a causal chain that will be a point of differentiation on the level of your guts and your digestive tract. But the chain of cause and effects will be ever more different. I took this to mean it's like what we think of as formative experiences and the kind of fantasies that are produced thereof have more to do with like the constitution of what we consider knowledge later in life and causality than any sorts of observations or just factual fact-based learning.
Right. And so what he's saying is that he's like replying to like a retort that Girondin was saying, because like Lacan's approach to language is something that, it's a structural linguistics thing. And so it has nothing to do with communication, but like, again, in the unconscious, language is not the same thing as speech, but of course, the speech act is like a vehicle for the symptom, which is structured via signifiers, right? And Verdon is confused about this, and he keeps trying to go with this verbalization, deverbalizing, and Lacan's talking about how the real is just not named, but it's not the same thing as deverbalization. And he's like, well, what about one's gut? what's happening inside, that's unnameable, but how it ends up being named. And he's like, no, this is, and that's when he gets into that whole like spiel about that, about like what's going on in the digestive tract, etc. And what's going on is, and maybe I'm misreading this, but like when he talks about historicization or the historicized story, it's like as you begin to work through what you are, is like beginning to retroactively name the position that you were in the past via the future, and come to some sort of Hegelian absolute knowing or recollection with words, but it's always already have occurred or some shit like that.
Yeah, what you said is better. I think that it's just like, I've always thought of these kinds of statements as pointing to this symbolic logic that's at play
Right.
before the, let's say, grown person logic is applied to what's going on.
Right. And the problem again is it's like with these like types of therapism bros, and it's not like he's, I think he's an analyst, like this person's an analyst, like all of them, but it's like he fits the perfect archetype of like a therapist bro, like therapism, happy signifier simp, but like they always see language as like, oh, a method of communication, this atomized form of thing that which is private and which is specific to each individual based upon their upbringing. Yeah, that may be the case, some particular way of speaking, whether it's some cultural difference or religious upbringing, whatever the case may be. But what they fail to realize is that no language is private, that really it's the structure of, to be Levi-Straussian, clans, kinships, alliances, or modes of productions that create not just language, but a discourse with symbolic identities that allow you to have a mediation to speak. That is something that goes beyond the privacy of a consciousness, an ego, but something that structures a symbolic identity. Which
we've been using discourse a lot, and Lacan does. Of course, he has 4 discourses.
Yeah,
but what is a discourse for Lacan? I think it's a symbolic chain of signifiers that would intervene.
it would be, and the trick is
That has truth effects, right? That has real effects on
yes,
our life worlds in one way or another.
the difference, and he'll say this later because he does say jouissance once, but jouissance is the factor that molds these discourses together, ways in which we enjoy our symptom or just, enjoy in general, which is different from like discourse in, like someone like Althusser or Foucault, like power discourse is something that dominates over a sphere of other discourses, which are pretty much modes of speaking and practices that establish a power relation. So right. A therapy discourse, or like the biology discourse, all these different things create certain signifiers or different concepts which create, like, all right, you got the gaze of the hospitalman or the doctor in the clinic, and then you got the patient whose body becomes dissected and fragmented by the power discourse of psychiatry or the hospital, in which they no longer become a human, but something to kind of categorize, to fix. That's a discourse to him. But for Lacan, a discourse is something in which jouissance or desire is enacted.
Right. I like that. Yeah. And when he develops his theory of the different discourses, they are all ways of managing jouissance.
Yeah.
And producing it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even though it's already there to begin with.
Yeah.
This is what you were talking about before, where he talks about exhausting the dialectic of narcissism and the obsessional. I like what he has to say here, that the obsessional's basic story is that he is entirely alienated in a master whose death he awaits without knowing that he is already dead, in such a way that he can't make a move. And it's this dead master who supposedly calls the shots, who cannot be acknowledged by the slave, who is the obsessional. In this sense, it's not that the slave in any way um it experiences any kind of like friction because of the dictates of the master, so much as what they want to scrupulously avoid is any sort of intimation that the master is dead.
Right. And
Right?
so
Because that is the ultimate fear. That is, in sense, their death, right?
right, no, exactly, and this is why I love this stuff right here, and this realm of theory that we in, because we could relate this to other texts in which these concepts play in. Again, the beginning of on the one chapter from For They Know Not What They Do, when he talks about the deadlock between the Slovene, what is a Slovene? The two different patients, one who both are impotent patients, but one who's a Slovene, and the other one who's like of high culture, whose wife died, and he experiences strong melancholy and can't have sex. Pretty much, the other one is more of like a very immoral, malicious person that likes to one up everyone, and even sometimes occasionally has sex with some prostitutes, but when the time comes, just can't seem to get it up, right? But somehow gets enjoyment from being cruel to others. But like the instances that both don't want to kind of engage the dead master, and of course they're both unanalyzable, but the paradox for like what I guess Zizek is getting at is that Freud sees that he can't see that the limit of analysis is not that the fact that it has to do with the Slovene, but like an epistemological one, right? I'm going too off, but like the point is that there is a dead master, and yet we don't want to kind of confront the deadlocks of this, which has to deal with our own enjoyment. And so why psychoanalysis is important is because it does not forgive ignorance. It has no big other to kind of point to forgive our own ignorance, our own obsessions, our own inability to enjoy. Whereas Christianity has a big other, the Father, God, that whenever we are ignorant and when we do wrong, we ask for forgiveness because we don't know what we do.
Right. It's like, oh, I need to plug my computer in. Just keep talking.
Yeah, and here's like where it's like why I think it's so crucial to understand the relationship between a dead master and the neurotic, is that the neurotic unconsciously knows that God is not only dead but in the unconscious, and how this has to do with life or death, not in the literal sense, but so far as it's constitutive to language and symbolic identification, and how the ego is resisting towards its own death, which some psychedelic bros might get a little like excited to be like, oh yeah, it's just the ego death. I take psychedelics and like my ego dies. It's like, that's not what it means. It means like this encountering of like things in which it can't relate to symbolically, because the symbolic instantiation, this network that's outside of us, fails, and the ego enters into that gaps of incompleteness. Like we see in Freud's dream, the ego of Freud can't relate to the corporeal throat or body of Irma. And so there is this kind of encountering of the real.
Yeah, I like how you put it before in that when we talked about that, but it's something that cannot be combined with which you
Yes.
cannot combine a perfect sort of smooth surface. So this is a cool section because he's saying, well, he mentions jouissance here, which may be one of the first mentions in either of the first two seminars, I believe. He might have said it once before, but it isn't, he said, he says it isn't by forcing him to abandon his discourse, but following it through to the end. If there's something that really sticks in your crawl that your patient's saying, that's not something to steer them away from. Just the fact that you might be having a kind of countertransferential response to it would be all the more reason to almost press into that, right?
Yeah.
So it's like
that's the whole point of like Lacan's notion of the transference.
There's only the transference of, this is what Dr. Hook said to us, right? There's only the transference of the doctor, the analyst, in the sense. Now, of course, it comes from the analysand, but the transference that, in a sense, I guess, I would imagine the analyst is the most concerned with is the one that really triggers a response in them. Because wouldn't you be the most attuned to your patient's transference if you're counter-transferring, or am I just...
No, well, I think you're confusing with resistance. Well, I mean, no matter what, there's always going to be that imaginary aspect. So, of course, like you can't help but have those feelings that come up. It's just to be, I guess, more in tune and always use your own transference, counter transference, not to relate to the patient, but I think be able to realize, oh, where am I like slipping from positing to myself as the object cause of desire, as allowing the unconscious to repetitiously appear to bring forth that insistence. So in a sense, it's just not in the imaginary sense of the way other schools of analysis would be. It is in a sense kind of being modest, not getting too excited.
I'm not saying how you would react, but rather when you're doing your scansion, I would think that maybe there's a almost kind of like symbiosis between transferences in this sense, where it's one's own response as analyst would be worth considering. As like I'm saying, Durandin here is experiencing frustration.
Well, yeah, and that's on the imaginary level because like there's
on the imaginary level. Yeah, I guess it wouldn't be symbolic then.
Because of the fact that, well, that's where the analyst has to realize not to overly identify with their position in an imaginary sense, and what the important symbolic efficacy of a psychoanalyst is supposed to do, and how they fit in that symbolic structure for the patient, because like they're a weird one in which like they're supposed to have this ability to in transference to give repetition insistence or to dupe the patient, but at the same time they're not being a master of certain chain of knowledge. It only comes from the transference on the part of the analysand in which they enigmatically express their desire and see the point de jour, what is it? Yeah, point de jour.
Plus de jouir.
Plus de jour in the analyst, which is the objet.
Right.
Because it's something they can't obtain. Because it's something they can't obtain. And the analyst doesn't have that. And it's only them being confused by their own position by overly identifying that they think they have it. And that's like where countertransference, I think, becomes susceptible or becoming susceptible to if they try to overly emphasize in their transference themselves.
Should we wrap this up with Pontalis?
Yeah, big pont.
big pump.
It's right here that he starts to question what like the notion of real, right, versus reality.
Yeah, he's asking a pretty hard hitting question here about the real, how it is different from the symbolic and the imaginary, but also how is the real different from what we call reality.
Yeah.
And what does Lacan say here?
Lacan says a lot, and then he also brings up like Oedipus again, the myth or the tragedy.
Right. And he talks, I also like the way he uses detour here. When he talks about not being able to lift this table, it's like, well, the real is sort of in the way almost. You're forced to take a detour around it in order to even define it, because that's why he doesn't have at this point, I mean, I guess because he doesn't have the most developed notion of what the real is, but he doesn't necessarily want to dedicate an entire chapter to it, or hasn't been talking about it, because if it is what kind of throws a monkey wrench into the symbolic, then we get at it through emphasizing maybe insistence on the one hand, or what he was talking about earlier in the seminar, the machine attempting to account for itself and failing to do so. These are all examples of the real.
Right. And I think it's Ponce Lisa's example of saying, well, I can't lift this table, and therefore there's just a limitation.
Well, that's Lacan's example.
Oh, okay.
But like, need to take a detour because he can't lift the table, so he's got to walk around the table, I'm assuming.
Yeah, but like it's never really that fact that makes you encounter the real. It's only through the detour itself that I think, is where the real is.
Right. And well, what he says here, to unpack that, there's no question of saying that the real didn't exist beforehand, but nothing that is effective in the domain of the subject emerges out of it.
Yeah.
Insofar as the subject exists, insofar as he sustains his existence, insofar as he raises the question of his existence, the subject with whom you are in dialogue, in analysis, and whom you cure through the art of speech, his essential reality consists in the junction of reality and the appearance of tables of presence. That's a tough
and so
tortured sort of
it makes
there, but
it makes me think of the beginning of Seminar 4, in which he talks about libido and this whole thing about like the symbolic order. It's like, of course, we could kind of hypothetically posit a pre-existing real, before the symbolic order, but like it isn't anything about like this whole substantial thing. Same thing that I mentioned earlier about the subject. It's only after the fact that we could posit something that exists potentially, right? And this is like his whole metaphor of the hydroelectric power plant, in which it does create the circuit for electricity to generate. And what is real is, I guess, the potentiality of that comes within the structure and circuitry that generates it. The potentiality being electricity, and obviously electricity gets generated from the power plant and the structure, but it can only be manifested through structuration, and yet there are gaps. And then we could retroactively posit some type of like before the structure, and even the excess of it. And again, we're talking about libido. Let's get away from the metaphor now, or drive, right? The symbolic order, bringing it back to the seminar, imminently creates impossibilities that can't exist within the structure, and it lessens it out, and yet somehow it comes back to kind of break down the symbolic order, or as he calls it, the machine that breaks down, and yet this anstos allows it to kind of continue to develop.
Right. Or the metaphor we've used before is that the machine isn't so much defined by the task it accomplishes as much as its inherent failure, where it, in some sense, is almost attempting to redress its own failure. And that's what defines the machine. What it can't do is as constitutive of what it is as what it supposedly can do. The illusion that it can do something, that it can achieve a certain goal, is considered to be translatable into its function. But in reality, it's like, or the real in this case is that if there is a kind of a tear in the symbolic order that prevents it from being completely totalizable, self-sufficient, then that tear, well, I don't even want to say a tear itself, because it can't even be taken in and of itself. The tear is a detour that ends up contouring everything within the symbolic order, making each signifier what it is, because it doesn't just, when we talk about gaps, it's not like there are stretches of consistency, stretches of smooth functioning, something goes wrong, it corrects itself. It's as if the tear runs equally through all of the contents of the symbolic order, if that makes sense.
No, and I mean, this tear is pretty much the same thing as like not just the gap, but like the crack of our being, our split, that we aren't wholly constituted because of the double alienation, the alienation separation that we experience because of language. And that language itself is not complete, which is also another, like, that's like the dialectic. There's a dialectic of the narcissism, like of this imaginary, to go back to For They Know Not What They Do, is the whole thing about like how the imaginary and the symbolic are not two separate things. It's that the imaginary reflects on itself, and in this double reflection is hooked on a symbolic order that creates that virtual point for us to instantiate our own being and position into language. But yet this language is not whole or one, because as soon as you talk about one, it's already split.
Right.
And that's,
it's like the split isn't between a nothing and a something. The split is also internal to the signifier. It's internal to the contents of the symbolic order, and it doesn't divide into two. It doesn't divide something into two. The split is between, in a sense, what is, and then the split itself. I don't know. This is getting very obscure.
It's like,
but
it's what it is in itself and for itself. Maybe that's too Sartrean. Like its constitution and determination, maybe.
Yeah, it's like you don't start with something whole that's split into two. You start with a split which reflected gives the appearance of a substantial whole to a content which is always just out of reach. But there are a million ways to
Yeah,
try to articulate that.
and
But
that's the problem of like people that like don't understand the dialectic, or they like the commonsensical way of understanding like the dialectic or Hegel. It's like, oh, which you got your thesis, then you got your antithesis, and even though these are two separate things, they come together at a point in which they synthesize. It's like, well, the notion of a thesis and antithesis already applies to positive entities, even though one is supposed to be in opposition with the other. They're positing two whole substantial statements that represent, I guess, entities of their own. And so it's like, how do they converge in this oneness? It's like, no, the thing about the dialectic is that any affirmation is already within itself split. And it
right.
is a reflection upon that.
Just like the positive and negative ends of a magnet, they only mean anything in respect to one another. But the negative and positive end, as soon as, I don't know, I guess if like you were to cut that magnet in half, now we're getting into ICP territory. Magnets, how do they work? But it ceases to have the positive charge can't exist on its own.
No.
The negative charge can't exist on its own.
Yeah, because
two entities.
Yeah, because even when you talk about like magnetism and like any type of like field of energy or potentiality, it's like the positive and negative magnitude could only exist upon of movement, and there is a double bind relation between the two. Even electricity, we talk about it. It's like when you talk about generation, it's a conductor. Was it in conductor? Inductor, and then a relative motion between the two, pretty much. But like ultimately that shows that like the positive and negative are kind of like inseparable. Even when you measure electricity, there's always like a negative and positive.
So the split there isn't between positive and negative, right?
No.
The split is between, on the one hand, positive, negative, and nothing at all.
Yeah. Which like, yeah, there's nothing is like a potentiality for the most part.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But we'll end it there.
That
I feel like I said a lot of cool sounding stuff, but
are you still recording?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure any of it amounted to anything.
It's still good though.